Hello and welcome to C-Suite Secrets. I'm Heather Parsons, your host. I'm a serial entrepreneur, fractional CFO, and a business strategist. I've spent years juggling business and family life while helping entrepreneurs scale, optimize cash flow, and build real financial success. On our show, we bring you real conversations with founders and executives that are actually moving the needle in their business. No fluff, no filler, just smart strategy, systems that work, and insights that you can put to use in your business right away. With that, let's dive in. Today on our show, we are joined by Paul Price. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heather. It's delighted to be here.
Thank you. We're happy to have you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. For folks who may not know you or know a lot about what you're working on, can you give them a little introduction and tell them how you got started?
Of course. I'm the owner of Argyle Executive Forum, which is a executive event business that I acquired in 2020. We produce about 100 events a year for senior business people and sponsors who like to engage them. And it's now year number 5 for me in this journey. Before that, thank you.
That's a big milestone.
It is, right? Thank you. I've thought about it a bit recently because, it's unusual in some respects, right? Prior to that, I spent around 9 years in the private equity world as an operating CEO for 3 different partners and had a couple of good exits, one catastrophe. Well, it wasn't really a catastrophe, but it wasn't as satisfying as perhaps it could have been. And before that, I spent most of my career in the advertising agency world, working mostly for Omnicom agencies. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around these parts. That brought me to New York City from Australia in 2001, and I've been a very happy New Yorker, Aussie American ever since.
I love it. That's quite a story. A lot going on there.
I've got more, but that'll do.
Yeah. Well, to kind of get us started, I'd love to hear, as you made the shift from private equity to owning your own business, what were some of the biggest things that you noticed that you had to change and overcome?
Well, firstly, there were the benefits immediately of, really having full independence on the strategic decisions. And with that, of course, comes the exposure. It's your money and you have to be, I think, a lot more cautious about the decisions that you make. That doesn't really go away. In fact, I think it becomes, in many respects, more amplified because you are faced with those decisions and they're very personal, and
Right.
they're always personal. But on the other hand, in my particular case, and I can't speak for others, of course, but I'm not, a manager who spends a whole lot of time in front of people. I tend to lead from behind, and the pleasure of doing that, I think, is also amplified, versus had I a different style, it may not nearly have been as successful to the extent that, we've been modestly successful.
I like that.
Thank you.
And I think that's, as I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, one thing that I run into a lot is if you are leading from the front, you have a tendency to also be a bottleneck in the business. And I think the whole, taking that time to step back and really let other people do what they're hired to do and what they're good at, I think is a huge strength in business.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's very easy, I think, to be tempted to stay in the trenches.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't do anybody any good unless, you've structured yourself with a team that wants it that way. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there's a room for every style of leader, depending on the business and the circumstances. And I think in my case, I've been trained really from a pretty early age, given the length of my career in the creative world, that there really aren't any micromanagement there's not much room for micromanagement in the creative services world.
Right. You've got too much stuff to do already.
No. Well, you do. And also, I think you've got people who are inclined to take their own initiative and also to one thing about the advertising business is that the stakes are always pretty high, the risks are pretty high. People know that. And typically the more successful people are those that are the more responsive and proactive, but also they're going to have a very strong point of view. And so you have to give a lot of room to those folks. And when you do that, you learn quickly that they are very successful. And of course, as a result of that, so are you.
Right.
At least that's been my experience.
Absolutely. I think building that trust and getting to know those people and then getting out of their way is huge for most leaders.
Right. Right.
And I want to also touch on one thing that you'd mentioned a few minutes ago around, all of the decisions are now, it's your money. It relies on you. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this as well. As I work with entrepreneurs, it's all about being intentional, knowing exactly why you're doing things, what's the expected outcome, and then really being able to say, okay, that didn't go the way I thought it would. So now I'm going to pivot or do something different. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what your experience has been as well.
I've been asked the question in different contexts, what is it that you might attribute to what modest success I've had? And my answer has changed over the years because I think that, modest levels of success are quite common. There needs to be a reasonably accessible answer to the question of what makes it happen. And, where I've landed, and as I reflect over my career, Darwin never said the most successful species were the fastest or the strongest or the smartest. He said they were the most adaptable. And I think that's where being an entrepreneur and being successful tends to come from your adaptability, first and foremost. Now, what you adapt to and how you adapt and so on are different questions. But, we've got to, I think, begin with the disposition to being willing to adapt and being set up for that perspective, because that's not as easy as it sounds.
Right.
Lots and lots of people get stuck in mental models. They get stuck in paradigms. They get stuck with their strategy. And I have loosened over the years my definition of what strategy needs to be. And I've been less and less concerned about longer term and more focused on shorter terms that I can control.
That's an interesting perspective, but I kind of like it, especially right now with the evolution of how we're doing business. I think, having a longer term vision in mind, but also knowing how you're going to execute today and what today is going to look like, because you have to react to those changes. Like, right. I don't know anyone 10 years ago who had AI on their business roadmap.
No.
Right. Or even 5 years ago for a lot of folks.
No. Much less the internet.
Right. I know,
it's
right?
Not that old either.
Exactly. So we're in that evolutionary period right now. Yeah. And being able to pivot and make decisions and change, I think is really smart. And it's huge for founders who want to continue and, like you, hit that 5-year mark. Because I've said this on many shows and in many interviews, 82% of businesses don't make that.
Yeah.
So that's a huge milestone.
It
is. And that's why we're really focused on trying to beat that number and helping as many entrepreneurs as possible get the tools they need to not be one of those statistics. Right. I would also love to touch a little bit about your VC background. If you had to go back and talk to that version of Paul, what's one thing that you would tell him before you move into this
area? You've got to make a lot of room for people, particularly when you have investors or in the private equity case, an investor and the team around that investor. When I first started, I would sit back and think, wow, do they really not know the answer to this question? Because I was getting all these questions about, to me, what were fundamentals, the kind of basics. But it was the case that they needed that level of counsel about, in my circumstances, the different types of businesses they were, they were. I'm a marketing services guy and digital marketing services guy. That's pretty much what I've been doing for the last 20, 25 years. And each of the businesses were a type of e-commerce marketing service, digital marketing service. But I expected the folks controlling the capital to have had a great deal more insight into the nature of the businesses and their operations and their marketing and so on. And I was quite taken aback by how heavily they were relying on the CEO and how important advice was to get and to give. It's a great deal more collaborative than I think anyone can risk underestimating.
That's interesting. So why do you think that some of those things that you saw as fundamentals, they really needed more counsel on?
Well, it just reinforces that you don't do these things on your own. You've got partners. They need pretty constant reassurance because, their time is spent across a portfolio, not necessarily dedicated to one business or another.
Yeah.
Now you might be the largest business in the portfolio, and therefore you might be getting the most attention. You may be needing the most attention because you're not doing what you should be doing. I had one partner who used to say, "Profit sets you free," which was a great way of, it's actually very funny, but
yeah.
But I digress from that because I think cash sets you free. I'm not sure about profit setting you free.
I'm with you on that. Consistent cash on top of that.
Yeah, and I think also there's a lot more of alignment in working with investor partners than you initially think. It's not that isn't appropriate, but I think the initial process of being targeted or recruited and getting to know one another through that process, and then doing these sort of obligatory strategic handshakes and management meetings around the numbers, all of that is important, but the alignment issue is always there, always, because I think there's a lot of fine tuning that goes on that you underestimate.
So talk to me a little bit about that alignment. Are we looking at like general values, that what you see in business, or what would they normally focus on?
Well, I think a lot of the alignment is just grounded in more knowledge of what the business really is or what the goals really are. From a strategic standpoint, setting goals are the most important process. I really, once you've done that, I think you're in pretty good shape. And sometimes people revisit those goals a little bit more frequently than I'd like, or they just do. And that can be constructive, but sometimes that can also be, it can devalue the strategy. So spending a lot of time getting that right together and being patient with that, is important on both sides of the aisle, right? Both
I like
the operator,
that.
right?
Yeah, and I think as you're talking, it also brings up another point for me as well around the timeline with a lot of this stuff. I know a lot of businesses, and even whenever I start working with folks, we try to have annual goals, but I think the more important goals are probably 3 to 5 years out because you really can't steer a ship, especially the size of a lot of businesses, quickly, not without some major fallout. So I love what you're saying around, having goals, having a strategy in place on how you're going to reach it. I mean, I think you can pivot on the individual deliverables on that goal, but if you're really thinking big enough, that goal shouldn't change for your business.
No, it can certainly be iterated,
Right.
It can evolve or adapt, but you've got to make sure that folks are coming along with you. The younger iteration of me was very guilty of seeing something way ahead of others. I'm not making that as a statement of superiority intellectually in any way. It's just that I had the time to think it through compared to others who are, engrossed in their everyday roles. Now, that was an enormous mistake because you can't afford to get too far ahead of the folks that you are dependent upon. And that includes the investors who ultimately, they need to be on board and they need to be on board all the time. Even the slightest, I think, ripple in that alignment can be really challenging to fix if you don't give it the time that it needs. But that's as true, if not more true, with the folks that you're collaborating with the team that you're running the business with, and the folks that are working with them to do the things that they need to do.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think because having that alignment and having the right people in the right seat on the bus is crucial, because one person in the wrong spot or not in agreement, or just my perspective, what I've seen more than anything is not necessarily disagreement, but maybe not understanding the vision and where people are going as much as they really should.
Right. Yeah.
Cause a lot of friction.
Yeah, it does. It does. And, sometimes folks aren't ready to bring up their concerns in the right time frames. So it's great to create opportunities for people to have a say. It's great to be overly communicative. I don't think you can ever over communicate. And also, you've got to continue to remind people that that's what we're up for. I would often in management meetings, again, a younger version of myself, but I still think this is appropriate. I would say silence is compliance. And that was typically meant to be provocative, and it usually worked. Just kind of look around the room and make sure that everyone had their say.
Right. And that way they don't have a grievance to air out later.
No. But you've got to give them that opportunity. The first step is doing that. A lot of people, I think, overlook the importance of that, and it's not a particularly difficult thing to do.
Right. It just requires more patience. I'll tell you really briefly. I remember going from a publicly traded company to a private company. And they were Fortune 50 company. They're a great company. And they were very slow on making decisions because they're doing exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
They were looking for that, not just collaboration, but really that buy-in and making sure everybody was on board. And it was really frustrating for me at first, as somebody who was used to having a CEO at the top and they made decisions and that's it, we're doing it. But whenever I started to see the benefits of that collaboration and that buy-in, we didn't revisit things the same way. We didn't go around and have that more of a, not necessarily just a sidebar conversation. It was more of all the ducks were already in a row. So people didn't have to go off and try to sabotage the project that they didn't they didn't agree with. So I think it's smart, and I've seen it time and time again that, fastest, I don't remember the exact saying, but, being very smooth and very methodical in the way you're doing things like that is really the fastest way to grow and move forward.
Right. Yeah, I think, for me, it's the coaching model of CEO. The role of the CEO is not to necessarily be on the playing field, and in sports, there's the occasional coach captain, in small teams or stuff like that. And that, that's going to suit a smaller business or it's going to suit smaller teams. But by and large, I think it's important that, that for me has always been a very useful model. If I've ever needed to remind myself, well, what am I doing here? What's the job? That's the model I tend to go to, because that's, I think, more reflective of what a CEO needs to do. Right. I don't even necessarily call the plays. If you take this analogy to football, that's not even the job, but that's the team's job. But you're certainly there to enable it.
Right.
you know.
Put the right players on the field, make sure they
Correct.
know the strategy
Correct.
and
Yeah.
what they're up against.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I couldn't agree more. You also talked about having some exits, two that were really successful and one that wasn't. I would love it if you could share what separates those good exits from a bad one.
Well, there's obviously the financial element, but that's that's a byproduct of being ready to exit versus I've been in front of folks who thought they were going to, but they weren't ready. And, that meant that the exit didn't happen because, buyers aren't, and buyers' representatives quickly have a sense of who's ready for purchase and who really isn't. The other thing, the flip side of that is that the less successful exit I was involved in, it was a classic case of no alignment, of misalignment. I mean, I could write a Russian novella for that one. It was just extraordinary. But that's essentially what the issue was. There was a founder, in my private equity career, I tended to be the last CEO. I was brought in to professionalize the management of the company, often to hire new management in roles that hadn't existed before, like a CFO or CHRO, right? And to shepherd their introduction to the business and to shepherd their acquisition of the responsibilities that you wanted them to take. Where in a couple of cases, founders were still there. They were still present. Usually, they're not. Okay. Usually, private equity will look to enable the founder's exit in order for, the business to be taken to where the private equity investment thesis wants it to go, which is typically seen as, beyond the founder's capability. That's why you're hiring an outside CEO.
Right.
Or an outside management team. However, in one particular case that didn't happen, and it was not good. It wasn't good.
I can imagine, and I think my husband and I talk about this all the time whenever it comes to our businesses. I think your business can only be successful to the point that you can lead it to. And I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing in management teams, or I'm really a huge fan of building out your advisory board.
Yeah.
Like, I can't tell you how many decisions I would have made differently without the ear of somebody who knows more than me about things like marketing, sales, because that's just not my strong suit. I spent a lot of time being really good in finance, and I'm good at that. And I think a good leader knows where they need a little bit more help, and they let people who are good at it take the wheel.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with that, Sam.
Yeah. So I'd also like to hear, everybody talks about wanting private equity, or they want to have investors come into their business. So what do you think is one dangerous lie that founders tell themselves when it comes to working with PE or other capital partners?
I wouldn't put it that way, but I do think there's often an underestimation of their role and the way in which that role is going to change with investors on board.
Okay.
And, investors are bringing a very different scoreboard to the table. My experience with the 3 different firms I've worked with were similar but different. And what made them very similar is that financially they're incredibly astute. They are extraordinary in terms of their analytics and their benchmarks, and the sophistication with which they bring capital management to the table, but they're also, at least in my experience, they're the first to defer to others when it comes to areas of expertise like marketing and like operations, of course. Some of them are more operationally oriented than they are demand oriented. I'm very much a demand side CEO, I was less perceived as an operational one, although I'm handy at it. But, I was typically hired to set the growth engine up and help the organization orient itself towards that, which is not as easy a thing as people think it is.
I believe that.
No, it's an altogether, it can be quite a strange concept for folks to see marketing as a system, which is what it is, and sales as a system.
Right.
Versus this kind of, what's the word? Adhocracy about sales and about marketing. We do things when we think we should versus, well, no, you do things that shape what is going to happen, and therefore you're not thinking about what should happen because a system will provide for that.
Right. They become more reactive than
exactly.
Having a good process.
Yeah. By the way, by their very nature, because they've been acquired and they've been acquired at sort of the scale that they are operating at, there's obviously elements of a system there.
Right.
Right. But what you're doing is you're padding that out with all of the other features of an ecosystem that's sustainable. I mean, that's, again, another very important model for me in thinking about a business. A business is an ecosystem. And it sustains itself because it sets up these interdependent parts that work together. As a consequence, that affords a lot more scale, and it affords a lot more cash generated as a result of, the velocity and the scale of sales that you've brought along, assuming everything goes well.
Right. Well, and I think about that from the CFO lens as well. One of the things, especially working with businesses who may not be to that level yet, I always look at the weighted pipeline. I want to know, how are the sales going, because if you're not feeding that machine, then all of a sudden it dries up, and then now you have real problems. Yep. So I don't just look at traditional finance metrics for that reason alone, because I think it is all interconnected, and you have to be watching them together to know if the business is truly healthy or not.
Right. And also, you can find elements of really unproductive culture. We haven't talked about culture much, but
it's a good topic, though.
Yeah, it is a good topic. It's the topic, in my view, because cultures, a founder's culture, will, by its very necessity, need to adapt to an organisation that's reshaping itself for another scale and taking another step. It doesn't mean that the founder's culture or elements of the founder's culture don't evolve with it, not at all. But it does mean that there's additions that come along that for a lot of people, they're not recognisable. And again, I get back to, marketing not as an art but as a system. For a lot of people, that's very challenging.
Right. It's not something you dial quickly, because it's longer term impacts. Just like as people now work on SEO or social media, it's not a, dollar today is a dollar tomorrow.
No.
And as we thought about it in the past, a lot of it's a much longer term play.
That's absolutely right. But on the other hand, there's attribution, and that's a big deal compared to, certainly, when I started in the agency world, and I'm not going to tell you that because it's disastrous. But, the big difference in marketing today is attribution. The numbers are there. They can be related to one another.
Yeah.
There is cause and effect, so to speak. It's just a question of how you model that and how you adapt to that, and how you avoid the mistake of mistaking the scoreboard for the goalposts, which is a, very common mistake.
Clicks does not equal closes.
No, correct.
Yep. No, I agree with you completely. But I think we're getting better at it. I think the more I talk to, especially folks who are in the digital marketing and doing all of that, they're getting really good at being able to tie it back to revenue dollars. They're
Sure.
getting really good at saying, okay, this is
Yeah.
truly what it cost me to acquire a customer. It takes a little bit more work on the finance side of things. It takes a little
Right.
bit more analytics. It's not as clean, but I
Right.
think that information makes a huge difference.
Right. No, I agree with you. Um, but that gets back to also being clear about what the goals are. There's
Yep.
this great little story about how Eisenhower framed D-Day. I don't know if you know the story, but
I don't. I'd love to hear it.
he did not set the goal as we're going to win Europe. He set several goals. We're going to take this beach and this beach and this beach and this beach. And I'm simplifying something which is dramatically more complicated than that. But his goals were very specific and related to a particular time frame. They weren't grandiose. When we're going to win World War II. Well, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to take this beach in order to win the Battle of Normandy. Which was sort of the point. And that's what made Eisenhower such an important guy in the right spot at the right time. Because others may have said it differently,
Right.
but there was a sort of clarity about you're going to do this and so on. And I think that's another mistake that executives and team members make is there's too much ambiguity in the goals, which makes change harder than it needs to be. Change is hard anyway.
Right. It is. I like your perspective on that. I think, being very clear and people understanding what the goal is and how they're going to achieve that goal is really
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I think most employees really want to be successful and they want to help achieve that goal. It's just how they get there.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not always easy to understand.
yeah. Yes, and that all gets back to sort of lots and lots of basics that really are important, like people having a clear understanding of what their role is and being reminded of that or having that renewed on a regular basis. I haven't done it yet because I don't typically like doing it at this time of the year, but by the end of January, everybody in the team will get, a point of view from me about here's the stuff I want you to get done this year.
Right.
And let's talk about that. It's not a job description. That's, I don't think, that valuable, but a statement from me to them about, look, here is what we need you to do in order for us to be successful this year is a very, very important conversation.
I agree. Because then it takes a lot of the trying to figure it out and the decision making out of it. They're
Right,
no longer trying to figure it out, they're just executing. So it
right.
speeds things up
It
astronomically.
does. It does, right? I mean, now, you want to present that with lots and lots of room. You're not,
Yeah,
but this is not something that you're adamant about. Again, the style in which you come at that is very, very important. So,
I like that. And talking about your experience in working in large agencies and PE, I'd love to hear what's one decision you think that leaders delay a little too long in making?
that's easy. That's making changes to things that aren't working, taking too long. I've made that mistake far too often in my career, and it's easy to pick when that decision's been delayed, particularly when it comes to people who aren't on board and they don't want to be on board. I could give you dozens of examples, dozens.
I believe that.
I'm too patient, and I think I'm too much of an optimist.
I think we,
And I'm not cut for the ruthlessness that I think others have, because I do, in my defense, I do weigh the incremental benefit of a change, You know, are you really going to get 10% better out of a new person than this person who, with a little bit of coaching, might be 5% better anyway, and that saves you all the trouble of making the change?
Right.
Versus someone who's toxic, who should have been gone months ago, maybe weeks ago, but we let it continue. That's been my experience.
I think that's a good point. And regardless of the organization, I see a lot of that. It's difficult because it's really hard to add a number to it. If you told somebody, hey, you've got to make 100,000 in sales and they're making, 60,000, it's easy to say, okay, you're not measuring up. But when it comes to a lot of the more soft skills, you mentioned toxic, this other stuff, it's a lot harder to say, you know what, there's something not right here.
Yeah.
And we need to fix it.
Yeah.
But you just don't fit.
Yeah. Yeah. You put a lot of time into building people.
Mm-hmm.
And even the ones who aren't as obviously toxic as they become obviously toxic to you.
Right.
So you've already got this prejudice in, what's the term, the investment that you've already made, and cutting that in an orderly but quick fashion is a mistake I've made repeatedly.
I understand. It's hard. It's not easy by any stretch.
I don't like doing it, and I'm not good at it.
I think that's okay. I don't think anybody wants to get good at it.
No.
But we just learn and move through it for sure.
No, but there are some that don't, there's some folks who just, they can rally up to that decision and make it and get on with it. I'm a little bit more pensive about it. And sometimes that's been a good outcome. That's probably the right. I had a boss who would say, listen, is this a 24-hour problem? In other words, would it go away tomorrow if you just left it for a day?
Yeah, right.
Which is a great question. And that's probably a question I ask myself all the time.
I like the 24-hour part. My husband and I, again, running multiple businesses, is it a 2-week problem? Am I really going to be upset about this in 2 weeks? If the answer is no, I might want to just pull my jets and go do something else for a minute.
Yeah, right. You might try cutting it to 24 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Also, I'd love to hear, moving from PE to owning your own business, what's something that you've learned along the way that was super valuable to you as you got started?
How to read a balance sheet. That was good.
I like hearing that.
Yeah, the PE guys were good at that. And I think, that how to really understand cash and its impact on the business. Yeah.
Those are the two hardest things, and the two things that I see most entrepreneurs struggle with the most.
Yeah.
The balance sheet, they don't fully understand it, and I understand why. It's not something that's talked about a whole lot, but it really is the clearest lens to overall financial health of a business.
Yeah. I had already been very thoroughly trained in forecasting, because one thing an agency does teach you is getting the forecast right. So connecting the forecast to cash and to the balance sheet, whereas, the P&L, don't get me wrong, it matters. Mm-hmm. But if you're getting the others right, it should be a pretty safe outcome.
Right. It almost takes care of itself.
Yes.
If you already have your cash flow in hand, you know what's on your balance sheet and what you're going to do about it. Exactly. And you have some goals tied around that, whether it's from an asset perspective or a reduction in liabilities. I think the P&L usually takes care of itself. The part that I see that's really hard for folks is that P&L has a lot of vanity metrics. Everybody's concerned with revenue. Everybody wants to hear the sexy revenue number, but at the end of the day, you can't eat your revenue number.
No, that's right. And, I get back to profit sets you free. That's really all that matters. May not it might mean that revenue went south in order for that to happen, but that's okay. In my view, that's okay. Now, I say that, I'd be kicked out of the boardroom if I did that in one of my private equity roles. But because I was hired for the completely opposite premise. But as an owner and investor, to me, that is more and more appropriate.
Right. And I think I say intentional a lot, and I truly mean that word, right? It's like, okay, if you do have a dip in revenue, number one, do you know why? And number two, was it intentional? Because if you're changing your client base and you're
Yeah,
saying, okay, this product here is costing me a lot more money, costs my employees a lot more time, and it's not as profitable. So I'm
right.
going to stop working with those kind of clients. And I'm going to focus on this other part of my business that really makes me money.
Yeah,
It makes sense to have a dip in your revenue. Total
yeah,
sense.
yeah,
It's not going to be permanent or forever, but at least you know why it's happening and you have a plan around it.
right. I do think, back to your question about what else private equity helps you, it brings to the foreground the importance of focus. Again, they're not that interested in getting sidetracked,
Right.
by their nature and by the nature of their job. And that helps you a lot in terms of realizing just how important focus is. And that's, to me, next to your ability to adapt, your ability to stay focused on the fundamentals of the business and the core product and the core people, and not to get distracted. But, these days I spend a lot of time avoiding time wasters,
Yep.
rabbit holes that you can go down that you really shouldn't have put any time into whatsoever. And as much as, your inbox gets filled with what might look like worthy pitches, not really.
Right.
Most of them aren't worth the time that they appear to. And you're just creating a whole lot more work for yourself by not focusing.
I like that. And I couldn't agree more, and I think that's something, especially people who are earlier founders who maybe don't have a full team around them just yet. I think getting some of that dead mental weight off of
Yeah,
your plate is huge.
yeah,
My EA and operations manager, they handle a lot of that stuff because really
yeah,
and truly, it doesn't need my brain power. It needs them to
right,
handle the scheduling thing,
right,
decide if, this is actually a real message to me and somebody I want to talk to, or it's cold outreach, which
right.
I don't know about you, but I get a lot of cold outreach.
Yeah,
Um,
I do too. Yeah,
so just trying to sift through all that stuff, because as founders and as executives, we don't have the mental bandwidth to waste on that. We have other
no,
real problems we can solve and a business to grow.
I agree with you.
So I'd also like to dive into your business now, reaching that 5 year mark. What are one or two things that you can really attribute that to as you have gone from, being in the marketing space, working heavily in PE, to now you're running your own business?
Well, I'd get back to focus because, the core of this business is fundamental to its clients. We're a lead generation system for clients. We connect them to people who are very difficult to connect with, and as a result of that, they get to build their pipeline. So being clear about what the business really is, I think, is a really important question to have and a discussion to have with yourself, as well as the folks that you really depend on. I would say that the strategy hasn't changed that much,
Okay.
um, but we've dabbled in some things that didn't work out. We've experimented. We've we've put little innovations into the marketplace to see how they go. We've tried that, which might have, in a more corporate setting, been shut down. Most of them didn't really get any real traction, but some did, and that's valuable. Our execution has always been pretty good, but whenever we've not executed well, it's cost us a lot of money. So, that's, I say a lot, I don't mean to over dramatize, but there are just some losses that could have been avoided by getting the execution better. And, I get back to cash and having good sources of credit that aren't expensive. Expensive credit can be really difficult on a business.
For sure.
So, having credit is an important issue, and being good at raising it is important. And I would encourage anybody that's making a step in their own way. I think having access to credit is a really important step to the longevity of a business, because I'm quite sure that a lot of businesses close simply because they couldn't raise the funds, or they didn't know how to,
Right. And they wait too late, right? So you never
Right.
want to ask for money when you need money. You
No.
never want to start establishing those relationships with potential investors when you need the investment.
Yeah. Yeah, I
It's,
learnt the hard way that I should have been raising money when things were great.
yep.
Right.
That's the best scenario, right? Because then
Yeah.
everybody's excited. And then
Yeah.
whenever you're in a pinch, people may
Yeah.
be a little bit more apprehensive or scared to
Exactly right.
make the
Yeah.
investment
Or
or give the loan.
it costs you a lot more than it should.
Right.
So I think, for me, it's been very satisfying, and in one sense, I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. But having said that, I feel like the business is in a really good spot. We've had cycles, and that's another reality of business, is that there are cycles, and some of them there's nothing you can do about.
Right. And
Then adapt to it rather than try to force it to change in your favor. That's not going to happen.
And your 5 years have been some of the most trying times in business that we've
Oh,
seen in 100 years,
yeah,
right? I mean, in all fairness, they really have. So anybody who has survived from COVID until now,
yeah,
that you have to be adaptable. You have to
yeah,
be able to look at a situation and say, okay, how am I going to change this? My
yeah,
husband and I were talking about restaurants that went out of business during COVID. We had some that we really liked and we were sad to see
yeah,
them go.
yeah,
But we also noticed that some of the places, they really adapted. They said, hey, I get you can't come in here to eat, but we're going to do things. We're going to make sure that you can take a
yeah,
steak home and cook it, give you instructions, do all the things. So they adapted and they really saw a difference and didn't have to shut their doors
yeah,
versus other folks who were just kind of waiting on
yeah,
somebody else to do it for them.
yeah. Yes, and I, 23 was, 21, 22 were really good for us, because we were, I think, probably the best in our category at adapting to digital. And we still remain very, very strong in that regard. It's the majority of our revenue. But 23, when COVID kind of started to go away and things sort of went back to normal, there wasn't really a normal; it was a new normal.
Right.
And we were late to adapting to that. But 24 was good, and 25's okay. But this has been a hard year.
Yeah.
Tariffs, the uncertainty, and the way in which I think business is changing. AI is obviously a big deal, but that's been very good for us. We
I'm
have
with
some
you.
big AI clients.
I think it's that adaptability, and I think we're going to go through times like right now. And the political uncertainty, it makes everybody nervous. And it's not just in the US. So I work with folks on a global front as well. And we see things that are a little strange in other areas of the world outside
Yeah,
the US. that
Yeah.
definitely impact how willing people are to invest, how
Yeah.
willing are they to buy products that they may be able to live without, even if it's not good for them.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be able to sustain our business and ride it out more than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's forced me to adapt to what, frankly, is a better operating model than the one I started with. Many of the basic services that we need, we don't staff in-house for anymore. That's been, I think, a really helpful way of adapting that I think is permanent in many respects, because once you're good at it, you never go back,
Right.
But that, on the other hand, that frees up the cash to do other things that are what you should be doing in-house versus outside.
Right. And, as I talk to folks who've made similar shifts to what you're mentioning, it frees up your bandwidth because now you're not managing something that may or may not have been in your wheelhouse to start with.
Correct.
Yeah. Streamlining your thought and your delivery and everything else. You still need the service.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily have to manage it in the same way.
No, exactly. I ran a systems integrator. It was actually the first private equity gig for me. And that meant engineers, developers. We had a server farm of our own,
Ooh.
Yeah, no, like hundreds of thousands of dollars in
It's
servers
to maintain.
Correct. Eventually we all saw the common sense in moving to the cloud, and it was Hurricane Sandy that ultimately just rammed home for us that we don't need to be in the server business, because we're watching a remote camera track how close the water was getting to flooding the very floor all these servers were on. I'll never forget it. Anyway, we were lucky. We got away with it, So again, I think I think there is this permanent and important idea about, well, what do you really want to be in business for? And what are you letting others do for you better than you probably could? Not a new idea really, but it's not easy to implement that.
Right. And it requires you to give up some control, right?
Correct.
And I think that's where a lot of entrepreneurs really get stuck, is that, okay, now I have to give up control for this piece of my business.
Right.
And where I try to challenge on that is you don't necessarily give up control, you just measure it differently.
Right.
So, managing vendors in my prior career and doing all that, you go from having to manage every inch of the operation to now you're managing a scorecard on how well they're delivering.
Yeah.
And I feel if you do it intentionally and you do it well and you're consistent, you can get very similar results, if not better.
Right. Right. I agree with you 100%.
Well, Paul, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've truly enjoyed it. One final question I have for you is, I'd love to hear one secret that you wish you would have known as you started out as an entrepreneur.
I don't think it's a secret, but I do think that you've got to be fast. I don't think that people realize that the pace you have to operate at now is much, much faster than the pace I remember operating at not long ago. And I think that that's lots of obvious reasons. Every company is an information technology company. Every company is a digital company. Every company is going to need to be an AI company, and you need to be on board that quickly before it overwhelms you. I think speed is really important. And I could write a tome on just how being slow is so dangerous.
I like it. I think that's some great advice. And I see that. I listen to a lot of other billionaires and big entrepreneurs, and every one of them consistently say the same thing, that don't wait for perfection.
No.
Get it done, reiterate as you go, and just move. No.
I can spot perfectionists a mile away, and I'm all over them about it. We want progress, not perfection. And a culture of get the stuff done and get it done fast isn't not about, asking people to do what they can't, perform miracles. That's just that, look, the pace at which we have to do things now is a whole lot different to the pace that folks have been used to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, this has been great. Before we wrap up, if our listeners want to reach out and learn more about your working on, how is the best way for them to reach out to you?
pprice@argyleforum.com.
Wonderful.
That's it. You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank
I had
you.
a lot of fun.
And thank you to everybody for listening to C-Suite Secrets. If you found today's conversation as valuable as I have, be sure to hit that like and follow button and share with somebody else who is building a business. If you want more tips on how to grow your business between episodes, you can find me on Instagram at Heather Parsons Official, or you can join our community on Facebook at C-Suite Insiders. Until next time, keep growing, and remember, you don't have to do this alone.